The man who hired George Atkins to bring her back did not know that George Atkins had a conscience, and that was the single greatest mistake Clifford Beaumont ever made in his 38 years of breathing. It was the spring of 1882, and the Texas panhandle was burning itself alive under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The wind came off the plain in long, hot gusts that smelled of alkali dust and dry grass, and the town of Haskell sat low against the horizon like a creature too tired to lift its head. George Atkins rode into that town on a chestnut mare named Ruby, with a folded letter in his breast pocket, a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard, and $50 already paid with another $100 promised upon delivery. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples from the sweat of 3 days of hard riding. He had done retrieval work before runaway apprentices, debtors who skipped counties, a man once who had stolen another man's wagon and thought Kansas was far enough. He had never, not once, been hired to bring back a woman. He told himself it was the same business. He told himself it as he rode past the dry goods store and the barber and the little church with its paint peeling off in long strips. He told himself it again when he stopped at the livery stable and handed Ruby over to the boy there, a freckled kid of about 14, who took the reins without a word and led the horse into the cool dark of the barn. George stood in the street and looked at the dust settling around his boots and tried to believe what he was telling himself. The letter from Clifford Beaumont had been brief and businesslike. It said that his wife, Irene Beaumont, née Atwood, had absconded from their home in Abilene 3 weeks prior, taking with her a small amount of household funds and a horse that was legally his property. It said she was disturbed in her mind, prone to fits of fancy, and that he was deeply concerned for her welfare. It said she was likely traveling west or southwest, as she had mentioned family in New Mexico territory once, though he doubted she would get that far on her own. It described her as slight, dark-haired, brown-eyed, approximately 24 years of age. It asked George to locate her, ensure her safety, and return her to Abilene with discretion and without drama. George had read the letter twice in the lamplight of his rooming house in Abilene before folding it carefully and sliding it into his pocket. The language of the letter bothered him slightly, the word absconded in particular, and the phrase disturbed in her mind, but men often spoke stiffly when writing letters about domestic matters, and he had not been in the habit of questioning the circumstances that brought him work. He had bills to pay. He had a horse to keep fed. He had a reputation to maintain as a man who finished what he started. What he had not counted on was Haskell. He had tracked her through 4 towns in 10 days, following a trail of small exchanges. A woman who had traded a silver brooch for a week's worth of food and lodging at a boarding house in Throckmorton. A woman who had sold a horse not stolen. It would turn out, because Clifford Beaumont lied about that too, for $12 at a trading post east of Seymour. A woman who had asked directions to the road heading west from 3 different people in 3 different towns and received 3 different answers. George was good at this kind of tracking. He had a patient, methodical quality that served him well in the field. He did not rush. He did not make noise. He gathered information the way a man gathers kindling, piece by careful piece, until he had enough to start something. He found her in Haskell because she had stopped running, at least for the moment. The woman at the boarding house on the south end of Main Street, a large, practical-faced woman named Mrs. Clara Hensley, told him that yes, there was a young woman staying in the back room, quiet as a mouse, had been there 6 days, paid for 2 weeks up front, and was working in exchange for the rest. Working how? Doing the laundry and helping with the cooking. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you talk about a good arrangement when you have found one. George stood on the porch of the boarding house and looked at the street and felt something shift inside him. He did not go in right away. He sat down on the porch step and took his hat off and set it on his knee and looked at the sky, which had gone from bruise purple to a pale, dusty amber as the afternoon wore on. He thought about the letter. He thought about the word absconded. He thought about a woman who sold her own horse. Not the husband's horse. He had since confirmed this sold her own horse for $12, which was criminally low, and worked laundry in a boarding house in a forgotten panhandle town. Women did not do this because they were disturbed in their minds. Women did this because they were afraid. He put his hat back on and went inside. Mrs. Hensley was at the front desk, sorting a stack of folded linens. She looked at him with the frank, assessing gaze of a woman who had seen many types of men pass through her establishment and had become expert at sorting them. "I need to speak with her," George said. "Alone, if that's possible. And I need you to understand that if she does not want to speak with me, I will leave. I am not here to cause trouble." Mrs. Hensley looked at him for a long moment. "She in some kind of trouble?" "I don't know yet," George said honestly. "That's what I'm trying to find out." That seemed to satisfy something in Mrs. Hensley, though he could tell she was watching him carefully. She pointed toward the back of the house. "She is in the kitchen right now. Been there since this morning." The kitchen was a long, low-ceilinged room at the back of the boarding house, smelling of wood smoke and boiled water and something with onions cooking slow in a pot. The window above the dry sink was open, and the afternoon light came through it in a long pale bar that fell across the floor and lit up the dust floating in the air. She was standing at the work table with her back to him, rolling out biscuit dough with the steady, focused concentration of someone who has made themselves useful because usefulness is the only armor they have left. He said nothing for a moment. He just looked at her. She was slight, as the letter had said, with dark hair pinned up in a way that had come partly loose, so that one long strand had fallen along the side of her neck. She wore a plain calico dress, dark blue, and a white apron that was dusted with flour. Her hands moved with efficiency and a kind of determined grace. She had not heard him come in. "Miss Atwood," he said. She went still. Not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of someone bracing. She turned slowly, and he saw her face for the first time, a face that was genuinely pretty in a way that did not announce itself, fine-boned and serious, with large brown eyes that were, in this moment, filled not with panic but with a kind of exhausted readiness. She had been expecting someone. She had perhaps been expecting someone for days. "How did you find me?" she said. It was not a question. "I am good at finding people," George said. He pulled a chair away from the kitchen table and sat down in it deliberately because standing in a doorway while a woman prepared to flee or fight was not a conversation he wanted to have. "My name is George Atkins. Your husband hired me." She watched him with those steady, tired eyes. "I expected it would be someone like you eventually. He has money. He has friends. He does not like losing things." She paused. "He would call me a thing." Something in the way she said it, quiet, not bitter, just factual, landed in George's chest like a stone dropped in still water. He kept his face neutral, but the ripples went out from that point. "He told me you were unwell," George said. Disturbed was the word he used. "I am not unwell," she said. She lifted her chin slightly, and for a moment she looked formidable despite the flour on her hands and the loose strand of hair and the exhausted set of her shoulders. "I am 24 years old, Mr. Atkins, and I have been married to Clifford Beaumont since I was 19. I'm very well aware of what I am doing and why I am doing it." "Tell me," George said. She blinked. That clearly was not what she had expected. She had expected threats, perhaps, or coaxing, or the firm but polite insistence of a man who had a job to do. She had not expected someone to pull up a chair and tell her to explain herself. "Why would you want to know?" she said carefully. "Because I was hired to bring you back," George said, "and before I decide whether or not I am going to do that, I would like to know what I am bringing you back to." The silence in the kitchen stretched long. Somewhere outside, a wagon went past in the street. The pot with the onions made a soft sound. Irene Atwood set down the rolling pin and wiped her hands on her apron with slow, deliberate movements, and then she sat down at the other end of the table and looked at him. And she told him. It came out in pieces at first, and then more steadily. She told him about Clifford Beaumont, who was 15 years her senior and had come to her father's house in Abilene with money and good clothes, and a manner that her father had mistaken for gentleness. She told him about the first year, which had been difficult but bearable. She told him about the second year, when she had lost a pregnancy in the 4th month, and Clifford had told her, calmly and without visible emotion, that she had failed him. She told him about the years after that, the way the house had become a place where she moved carefully, always calculating the distance between herself and the nearest door, the way she had learned to read the shift in his expression that came just before his mood darkened, the way she had stopped writing letters to her sister in Santa Fe because Clifford read her mail. She told him about the night 3 weeks ago when she had finally understood, in the clear and terrible way that clarity sometimes arrives, that if she stayed she would not survive it, not in the obvious, dramatic way of dime novels, but in the quieter, more complete way of a person whose self has been systematically dismantled until there is nothing left. She had packed what she could carry. She had taken the horse her horse, bought with money from her own mother's estate, and she could prove it, and she had ridden out before dawn on a Tuesday and had not looked back. "I know it looks like I am running away," she said. "I know that is what he told you. But I am not running away from something. I am running toward myself." She stopped and looked at her hands on the table, flat and still. "That might sound foolish to you." "It does not sound foolish," George said. She looked up at him with an expression that held both surprise and an old, habitual wariness, as though kindness were a thing that had proven unreliable often enough that she had learned to be careful with it. He sat with everything she had told him for a long moment. Outside, the afternoon light was deepening. He could hear Mrs. Hensley moving somewhere in the front of the house. "Your sister is in Santa Fe," he said. "Yes. She married a man named Davis. He runs a print shop there. They have been trying to get me to come for 2 years, but Clifford would not allow it." She caught herself. "He said it was not convenient." "How far is Santa Fe from here?" George said. She studied him. "Perhaps 400 miles, maybe a little more through the eastern route." A pause. "Why are you asking me this, Mr. Atkins?" "I am trying to figure out," George said slowly, "how much of a head start you would need." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had a different quality to it, charged and uncertain like the air before a storm. "You are not going to bring me back," Irene said. It was barely a statement. It was more like a thing she was testing the shape of, turning it in her mind to see if it held together. "No," George said. He was somewhat surprised to hear himself say it, even though he had felt it coming since she had begun to speak. He was a man who honored his commitments and took his work seriously, and he was sitting in a kitchen in a panhandle town telling a woman he had been paid to find that he was not going to do his job. Some part of him noted this with a kind of bemused detachment. Another part of him had never felt more certain of anything. "He will send someone else," she said, "or he will come himself." "Eventually, yes," George agreed. "Which is why you need to be gone from here before I ride back to Abilene." "You are going to ride back," she said, working it through, "and tell him what?" "That I followed the trail west and it went cold somewhere past Seymour. That I believe you may have gone north toward Colorado. That I spent 10 days looking and found nothing useful." He shrugged. It was a clean, economical shrug. "It will buy you time. Not unlimited time, but time." She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, complex and unguarded in a way that her face had not been since he walked into the kitchen. "Why?" she said softly. "Why would you do this? You were paid. You are a professional." "I am a professional," George agreed. "And in my professional assessment, the job I was hired for was not what I was told it was. A man who lies to me about the nature of the work forfeits my loyalty." He paused and looked at the table. "And a woman who has done nothing wrong except try to live does not deserve to be dragged back to a life that is killing her. That is my professional assessment." Something moved across her face then. It happened quickly, like light through fast clouds, a loosening, an easing, something that might have been, in a different moment, the precursor to tears. But she was not a woman who cried easily. He was already beginning to understand this, and instead she pressed her lips together and lifted her chin again. "Thank you," she said. "It was very quiet." "Do not thank me yet," George said. "You have a long road ahead of you, and I am going to suggest something that you are free to refuse." "What is that?" He looked at her steadily. "Let me ride with you to Santa Fe, at least to the New Mexico territory border. The road through the Llano Estacado is not kind to lone travelers, and Clifford Beaumont is going to be looking for a woman alone. He will not be looking for a woman with a companion." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. "You would do that," she said finally. "You would escort a woman you have never met before today across 400 miles of open country." "I would," George said. He found he had nothing more elaborate to add to this. It was simply true. "I cannot pay you," she said. There was no apology in it, just practicality. "I am not asking for payment." She looked at him for another long moment, and he let her look, did not shift under it or try to fill the silence. He had the patience of a man who spent a great deal of time alone and had made his peace with it. "All right, Mr. Atkins," she said at last. "You may ride with me to the New Mexico territory border." "Just to start," George said, and there was something in the quiet way he said it that made her look at him sharply. But his face was composed and respectful, and she decided she had imagined whatever she thought she heard in those 3 words. She had not imagined it. They left Haskell 2 mornings later before the sun had fully risen, when the sky was still that deep pre-dawn gray that made the world look like a charcoal sketch of itself. Mrs. Hensley, who had been told only that Irene was moving on, pressed a cloth sack into her hands at the door, biscuits and dried beef, and 2 hard-boiled eggs. She held Irene's hands for a moment after passing the sack over and looked at her with the no-nonsense compassion of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know what a fleeing woman looked like, and said, "You go on and be well now." That was all she said. It was enough. George had arranged the horses Ruby and a calm, durable gray gelding he had purchased for Irene from the livery stable, with the rest of the money Beaumont had paid him, which he figured was the least the man could do, even if he did not know he was doing it. The gray gelding was 10 years old, steady, not fast but reliable, and he took well to Irene from the first moment she put her hand on his neck and spoke to him quietly. "What do you call him?" George asked as they rode out of Haskell onto the westward road, the town going quiet behind them. "I have not decided yet," Irene said. She was watching the horizon, which was beginning to lighten in the east behind them, a thin line of copper above the dark plain. "I will know when I know." George nodded. He found he liked this answer. The first day of riding was almost entirely silent between them, not an uncomfortable silence, but the silence of 2 people who are getting used to the rhythm of each other's presence. The land around them was immense and flat and extraordinary in its way, the grass going on and on under a sky that seemed to have no ceiling, interrupted only by the occasional dark shape of a windmill or the distant silvery line of a dry creek bed. The wind was constant. The sun, once it came up, was serious about its work. By midday they had covered perhaps 20 miles and stopped to water the horses at a tank fed by a slow-moving creek south of the road. George watched Irene dismount with the easy, practiced movement of someone who had grown up on horseback, who had not always lived in a townhouse in Abilene waiting for a husband's mood to settle. She moved differently out here, he noticed. There was less of that careful, calculated quality to her movements. She breathed differently. They ate Mrs. Hensley's biscuits sitting on opposite sides of the creek bank, the horses drinking and swishing their tails in the midday heat. A pair of scissor-tailed flycatchers worked the air above the grass, their long tails scissoring behind them in extravagant loops. "Where are you from originally?" George asked. It was the first real question he had asked her since the kitchen, and she took a moment before answering, as though deciding what kind of conversation this was going to be. "Here more or less," she said. "My father ranched west of Abilene. I grew up on horseback. I grew up knowing this country." She looked out at the flat, shimmering plain. "I missed it." Clifford thought the outdoors was provincial. He preferred the parlor, a small, dry pause. He preferred anywhere he could control who came and went. Your mother, George asked, died when I was 17, left me a small amount of money that I had managed to keep Clifford from knowing about. That is what I used for the horse. She looked at him. You said you confirmed it was my horse. I did, George said. The bill of sale was registered in your name before the marriage. He knew it was yours. He told me otherwise. She was quiet a moment. That is not surprising. He has always had a flexible relationship with the truth when it suited him. She picked at the biscuit in her hands. He is very charming, you understand. He is very well thought of in Abilene. When I tried to speak to the Reverend there 2 years ago, I did not even tell him everything, just enough. The Reverend told me that I needed to be a more patient wife and that Clifford was a pillar of the community. She said it without particular bitterness, which somehow made it worse. George thought about Clifford Beaumont, who had sat across from him in a leather-upholstered chair in a well-appointed Abilene office and spoken about his wife with the measured concern of a man who was simply worried, simply trying to do right by a troubled woman. George had taken the job. He had taken the money. The weight of that sat with him, and he did not try to push it away. I am sorry, he said, for taking the job. Irene looked at him with those careful, assessing eyes. You did not know, she said. No, but I should have asked more questions before I started. She considered this. You are asking them now, she said. That counts for something. They rode on. The second day brought a change in the weather. The sky to the southwest built up enormous white towers of cloud by mid-morning that turned gray and then dark gray by afternoon, and by the time they reached the small settlement of Post Oak Springs, which was barely a settlement, just a general store, a blacksmith, and 4 or 5 scattered houses, the wind had shifted and gone cold, and the smell of rain was in the air. The general store was run by a man named Ephraim Walters, who was perhaps 65, with a white beard and the sort of unhurried manner that comes from living for a long time in a place where very little happens quickly. He allowed them to shelter in the store's back room when the storm broke, which it did with sudden and total conviction, sheets of rain, and a wind that rattled the store's windows in their frames, and sent a tin bucket rolling across the yard outside with a tremendous clattering. George and Irene sat on upturned crates in the back room while the storm hammered the roof overhead, and old Ephraim brought them coffee in tin cups without asking if they wanted it, because it was obvious they did. Heading west, Ephraim said, settling himself on a barrel across from them. New Mexico territory, George said. Ephraim looked at them with the calm, non-judgmental curiosity of a man who had seen many kinds of travelers pass through. Husband and wife, he asked. There was a small pause. Irene and George did not look at each other. Traveling companions, George said. Ephraim accepted this without comment. He told them about the road ahead, that the section through the Llano Estacado proper was dry and exposed, and that they would want to carry extra water if they could manage it, that there was a reliable spring about 40 miles out that most travelers did not know about because it was half a mile south of the main road, that the Comanche had been largely relocated to the reservation at this point, but that there were still occasional bands who moved through the high plains, and that he did not say this to frighten them, but simply because it was worth knowing. Comanche have been on the reservation for years now, George said quietly, with a note of something in his voice that Irene heard but could not yet name. Moved there in 75. That does not mean the reservation has been kind to them. Ephraim looked at George with a slightly sharper interest. You know something about that? My mother was half Comanche, George said. He said it simply as a fact without either apology or performance. Her family was from the band that gave up first, the Quahada. She married a white settler when I was not yet born. She died when I was 11. I grew up with my father in Kansas. Irene was looking at him. This was the first personal thing he had said about himself in 2 days of riding together, and it landed in the middle of the conversation with a quiet weight. The reservation has not been kind to them, Ephraim agreed, with what seemed like genuine regret. I have seen some of the men come through here sometimes looking for work. Good men, hard time of things. Yes, George said. He drank his coffee. There was a finality in the word that closed the subject gently, and Ephraim, who was a perceptive man, let it close. Later, when Ephraim had gone to tend to something in the front of the store and the rain had softened to a steady drum on the roof, Irene said, "I did not know that." "About your mother. There was no reason you would," George said. "It explains something," she said thoughtfully. "What does it explain?" She looked at him with that direct, serious gaze that he was beginning to understand was simply how she looked at things she wanted to understand fully. "It explains why you asked questions before you made up your mind. About me, about the situation." A man who has seen people dismissed or reduced because of who they are tends to look a little harder before he accepts the easy version of a story. George was quiet for a moment. It was a more perceptive observation than he had expected, though he was beginning to revise his expectations of her upward at a fairly steady rate. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I just had a feeling something was not right." "Both can be true," Irene said. "Both can be true," he agreed. The storm passed by nightfall and left the air scrubbed clean and cool, the stars coming out in extraordinary numbers as the clouds thinned and dissolved. They slept in the back room on their bedrolls, George on one side of the room, Irene on the other, with scrupulous propriety. And in the morning Ephraim Walters would not take money for the shelter, only for the coffee and the extra water canisters George bought from him. They pushed on into the Llano Estacado on the third day, and the landscape changed in a way that George found both austere and compelling. The high plains had a quality to them that was unlike anything else in Texas. A vast, level plateau that went on in every direction with the absoluteness of a held breath, the grass short and tough, the sky enormous, the silence so deep that you could hear your own heartbeat in it if you stopped moving long enough. Irene rode beside him without speaking for long stretches, and without seeming uncomfortable in the quiet, and George found that this was a quality he valued profoundly. He had been in the company of people who could not stand silence his whole adult life, men in bunkhouses who talked to fill the air the way some people drank, compulsively and without particular pleasure. And he had always felt slightly outside of that, had always been more at home in the kind of quiet that two people can share without it meaning something is wrong. On the fourth day they talked for most of the afternoon, and George was not sure afterward how it happened, only that it did. She told him about growing up on her father's ranch, the horses, the cattle drives she had watched from the fence as a small girl, the time she had ridden all night to bring the doctor when her father broke his leg in a gully, the way her mother had taught her to cook on an open fire, and how the boarding house kitchen in Haskell had felt, strangely, like coming home to a thing she thought she had lost. He told her about Kansas, about the years working cattle before he had drifted into the retrieval work, about a winter he had spent snowed in at a line camp in the Colorado Territory with nothing but 2 horses and a stack of dime novels for company, and how he had read every one of those novels 3 times through before the snow cleared. She laughed at this, a real laugh, not polite, not careful, and the sound of it startled him pleasantly, the way the unexpected call of a bird startles you on a quiet morning. "What were the novels?" she asked. "Terrible ones," he said. "Men with names like Deadshot Dan and Silver-Tongued Slade doing improbable things in improbable places." "Did you enjoy them?" "I enjoyed them enormously," he said. "By the 3rd reading I had started arguing with the plots out loud." She laughed again, and this time it lasted longer, and he felt something shift further in the arrangement of himself, like furniture being moved to better positions in a room. On the 5th day they found Ephraim's spring, half a mile south of the road exactly as he had described, and they watered the horses and filled every canister, and rested in the shade of a small stand of cottonwood trees that had established themselves around the spring, with the defiant ingenuity of things that insist on growing where growing is difficult. The gray gelding had begun to show a slight preference for standing close to Ruby when they were stopped, and Irene had noticed this. "He has made a friend," she said, watching the 2 horses. "Ruby is particular about who she tolerates," George said. "She must approve of him." "What is his name?" Irene asked. She had been thinking about it, he could tell. "That is for you to decide." She was quiet a moment, watching the gray gelding with his nose at the water. "Cottonwood," she said then, with a small note of decision in her voice. "For this place, for the trees." "Cottonwood," George repeated. He found he liked it. It was a name that held something specific, a memory, a moment, a root in a real place, and that seemed right for a horse that was carrying a woman toward a new life. On the sixth evening they camped in a shallow draw out of the wind, and after the fire was going and the coffee was on and the horses were settled, Irene sat across the fire from George and said, without preamble, "Tell me about your work, the retrieval work, before me." He did. He told her honestly, including the parts that were less flattering to him, the times he had not asked enough questions, the debtor he had returned to a man who turned out to be a loan shark rather than a legitimate creditor, the things he had done for money without thinking too hard about what the money was for. He did not dress any of it up. He told it plain. She listened without interrupting until he was done, and then she said, "And after this, what will you do?" "I have been thinking about that," George said, and he looked at the fire. The cottonwood draw was full of its own quiet, the fire snapping softly, the horses moving occasionally in the dark. "I have some money saved. Not a great amount, but enough to start something modest. I have been thinking about land." "Land," she said. "A small place, somewhere in the territory maybe, not a cattle ranch, that is too large an undertaking, something smaller. A few acres, horses, maybe some crops." He paused. "I am better at the practical things than the social ones. I am not built for a town." Irene was looking at him across the fire with an expression that had gone thoughtful and still. "I grew up on land like that," she said quietly. "My father's place was not large, it was enough. It was a good life before." She stopped. "Before Beaumont," George said gently. "Before everything changed," she said. She was looking at the fire now rather than at him. "I used to think I would have that kind of life again. For a long time I stopped thinking it. In Abilene it seemed very far away." "It is not far away," George said. He said it simply, not with the forced cheerfulness of reassurance but with the steady certainty of someone stating a fact. She looked at him across the fire again, and the firelight did something to her face, lit the planes of it, made her eyes very dark and very bright at once. And George was aware with sudden, complete clarity of exactly how dangerous this stretch of road had become, for him personally. He had ridden out into the panhandle to do a job, and he had, within the span of a week, found himself in a situation that had nothing to do with any job he had ever been hired for. He was acutely, uncomfortably, and completely aware that Irene Atwood was still legally married to Clifford Beaumont, and that she was a woman in the middle of a crisis she had not yet gotten to the other side of, and that the decent, correct thing to do was to escort her safely to Santa Fe and say goodbye and ride away. He told himself this with some firmness. He also knew himself well enough to know that he was not entirely sure he was going to be able to do the correct thing, because the correct thing was going to be very difficult when the incorrect thing was sitting across a campfire from him with firelight in her dark eyes, talking about the life she had wanted before the wrong man took it from her. He looked away from the fire and looked up at the stars instead, which were safer. On the seventh day they crossed into New Mexico territory, and the landscape shifted again, the flat plain giving way gradually to more sculpted terrain, the grass giving way to sage and pinon and juniper, the horizon developing contours and heights, and a sense of depth that the panhandle had not offered. Irene sat up straighter on Cottonwood when they crossed the unmarked but understood line of the territorial border, and something in her face changed. "Are you all right?" George asked. "Yes," she said. She breathed in slowly. I am past the line. I did not know if I would get past the line." George said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. She had made it past the line. That was the whole of it. They stopped that night at a small trading post run by a Mexican family named Montoya, a man and his wife, and 3 grown children who ran the post with the efficient warmth of people who understand that hospitality is its own economy in remote country. The wife, whose name was Francisca, took one look at Irene and began speaking to her in swift, quiet Spanish, and Irene answered in Spanish that was hesitant but present, learned somewhere back in the ranch childhood. And Francisca nodded with great satisfaction and showed her the room where she could wash properly for the first time in a week. Señor Montoya brought George mescal and sat with him on the porch while the evening settled around the trading post, and the two men sat in companionable quiet watching the sky go purple and then dark. "Your wife," Montoya said, with a sideways look, "she has been through something." "She is not my wife," George said. "She is someone I am escorting to Santa Fe." Montoya looked at him with the patient, slightly amused expression of a man who has seen many things and knows a few that the person in front of him does not yet know about himself. "Of course," he said, and poured more mescal. Later that night, George was sitting outside on a low bench looking at the moon, which had come up full and white and enormous over the eastern scrubland, when Irene came out and sat beside him. She had washed and changed her dress. She had a second one, a green one, that she had been saving, and her hair was down, which he had not seen before. It was longer than the pinned-up version had suggested, and very dark, and he looked at it for slightly too long before looking back at the moon. "Francisca asked me if we are married," Irene said. "Montoya asked me the same thing," George said. A pause. "What did you tell him?" "That you are someone I am escorting to Santa Fe." She was quiet a moment. "She told me I should keep you," Irene said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite teasing and not quite serious, something in between, cautious and exploratory and slightly warm. George turned his head and looked at her. She was looking at the moon, her profile clean and still against the dark. "What did you say to that?" he asked carefully. "I said that it was not so simple." She paused. "She said the simple things are almost never the simple ones." They sat with this for a while. The moon moved very slightly on its slow arc. An owl went by in perfect silence somewhere overhead. "George," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and it landed differently than Mr. Atkins had, landed with a different weight and a different meaning, and they both felt it. "I need you to know something." "All right," he said. I am not a woman in need of rescuing. I want to be clear about that. I got myself out. I made a plan and I executed it, and I am here in New Mexico territory on my own." "I know that," George said. "I am very aware of that." "Good. Because I do not want you to think." She stopped and tried again. "Whatever this is," she said, gesturing vaguely between them, "whatever this thing is that is happening, I need it not to be about rescue. I need it to be between two people who are standing on equal ground." George looked at her for a long, serious moment. The moonlight was very strong and made everything very clear. "Irene," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name that way, just her name, without miss or anything else before it, and she went very still when he said it. "The last thing in the world you appear to need is rescuing. What you appear to need is someone who will ride alongside you, which is different." She looked at him. Her eyes in the moonlight were very dark and very bright and very direct. "Yes," she said softly, "that is exactly the difference." They sat outside until the moon was high overhead, and then went into their separate rooms in the trading post. And George lay on his back in the dark looking at the ceiling and thought about the next 100 miles to Santa Fe and what he was going to do when he got there. He thought about Clifford Beaumont and the lie that had hired him and the $100 he had never collected. He thought about the word absconded and the word disturbed and the letter in his breast pocket that he had been carrying for over 2 weeks now. He thought about Irene, 5 years ago at 19, meeting a man with good clothes and a charming manner and a father who mistook that charm for gentleness. And he felt a slow, controlled anger about this that was different from any anger he had felt before, not hot and explosive but cold and durable, the kind that does not dissipate but settles into something purposeful. He thought about land in New Mexico territory, about a small place, about horses and sage and a sky that went on forever, and a woman who had talked about the life she had wanted before everything changed. He thought about what it meant to stand on equal ground. He did not sleep for a long time. The next 3 days of riding brought them down from the higher plateau country through terrain that grew increasingly dramatic, red rock formations appearing on the horizon and growing nearer, the mountains becoming real and specific in the distance, the air carrying the smell of juniper and something else, something piney and cool, that grew stronger as they descended. New Mexico territory was a different world from the Texas panhandle, older and more layered, the land marked by centuries of human presence, the ruins of old pueblo structures visible sometimes on the tops of mesas, the roads crossing older roads, the whole landscape resonant with a history that the Anglo settlers had only recently arrived to add their chapter to. Irene talked more on these days. The closer she got to Santa Fe, the more words seemed to come available to her, as if proximity to safety were unlocking something that had been held tightly shut. She talked about her sister, whose name was Clara Davis, née Atwood, who was 3 years older and had always been the braver of the two. She talked about her sister's husband Thomas, who ran a small print shop on the south side of Santa Fe's plaza, and who had sent a letter 2 years ago that Irene had read once and then burned in the fireplace before Clifford could find it. A letter that said simply, "The door is open, whenever you are ready." She talked about what she wanted to do with herself in Santa Fe. She had thought about this with the careful, practical mind of someone who has had to make plans quietly and keep them to themselves. There was a women's school on the east side of the town. She could teach, she thought. She had the education for it. She had always been good with children, and she had years of a particular kind of resourcefulness and adaptation behind her that she believed would serve her well in teaching young people how to navigate a world that was not always arranged to their advantage. "You would be a good teacher," George said on the second of these days, as they rode along a road that followed a shallow, clear-running stream below a long red cliff face. "You cannot know that," she said, but she was pleased. "I have been watching you for 9 days," he said. "You listen carefully. You adjust based on what you hear. You are patient, but you are not passive. You say things plainly. These are good qualities in a teacher." He paused. "They are good qualities in general." She looked at him sideways. "You have been watching me for 9 days. I have been riding beside you for 9 days. It would be difficult not to notice things. What else have you noticed?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You are more comfortable in the open than in enclosed spaces. You prefer to know the layout of any room you enter. You watch doors. You are a better cook than you let on. Every time you have helped with the fire, you have done it with more skill than a person mentions. You have a very specific laugh that only comes out when you are genuinely amused, and it is different from the polite sounds you make when something is only slightly amusing. You name things carefully, and only when you are sure of the name." She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, a kind of open, unguarded wonder, as if she had not expected to be seen this clearly and was not sure how to feel about it. "That is a great deal of noticing," she said quietly. "You are a great deal worth noticing," George said. He said it simply, without decoration, the way he said most things, and it hit her with the precision of an arrow because of that simplicity. She looked away at the red cliff face above the stream and was quiet for a while. "George," she said eventually. "Yes. Whatever happens in Santa Fe, whatever I figure out about my situation, about the legal business, about what comes next, I want you to know that this has mattered. These days. What you did, turning around and riding with me instead of back toward Abilene, it mattered. It mattered to me too," he said, "for what it is worth." She looked at him again. "It is worth a great deal," she said. They arrived in Santa Fe on a Tuesday afternoon, 10 days after leaving Haskell, under a sky full of enormous white clouds, and a sun that struck the adobe buildings of the town with a warm, golden light that made the whole place look like something from a painting. The town was older and more complex than George had expected, a place where the streets were narrow and winding, and where Spanish and English and the languages of the Pueblo people wove together in the air of the plaza, where the Church of San Francisco loomed at the north end with its pale adobe towers and its 400-year-old quiet, where the smells of chili and wood smoke and leather and horse all mixed together in a combination that was unlike anything George had encountered in Kansas or Texas. Clara Davis found them before they found her. George was asking about the print shop at the post office when a woman appeared in the doorway taller than Irene, the same dark eyes but with a more immediately open expression, and said, "Irene," in a voice that held a year's worth of worry and relief compressed into 2 syllables. What followed was a reunion that George watched from a respectful distance, pretending to examine a posted notice on the wall of the post office. The 2 sisters held each other for a long time in the doorway, and Clara said things into Irene's hair that George could not hear, and Irene shook her head several times with the particular motion of someone saying no. "I am all right. I am truly all right." Thomas Davis appeared behind Clara, a lean, angular man with ink stains on his hands and a kind, serious face, and put a hand on his wife's shoulder and looked at George with a questioning expression. George extended his hand. "George Atkins," he said, "I rode with your sister-in-law from the panhandle." Thomas Davis shook his hand with a firm grip and a nod. "Thomas Davis, I take it you are the reason she arrived here rather than being sent back." "She is the reason she arrived here," George said. "I just rode alongside." Something approving moved across Thomas Davis's face. He nodded again, more slowly. "Well, Mr. Atkins, you had better come to supper." The next days in Santa Fe were full and warm and complicated in the way that reunion days always are. Clara and Thomas had a house on a side street 2 blocks from the print shop, a good-sized adobe with a courtyard where a fig tree grew and where the evenings were cool and fragrant. Irene slept in the spare room and ate at the family table, and was treated by her sister with the particular fierce tenderness of someone making up for lost time, which Clara apparently intended to do as efficiently as possible. George stayed at a boarding house near the plaza and spent his days getting acquainted with Santa Fe, which was not difficult to like. He found himself thinking about land. He had already been thinking about it, had been thinking about it since the campfire conversation in the Cottonwood Draw, but in Santa Fe, the thinking became more specific. He went to the land office on the 3rd day and asked questions. He rode out on the 4th and 5th days to look at specific properties, a small parcel 8 miles northeast of town with a good spring and a standing structure, another one further out to the east that had more acreage but no water. He was methodical about this. He made notes. He had the particular quality of a man who, once he has decided a thing, proceeds with practical, unflustered purpose. He also went to see Irene every day. This was less methodical and more simply necessary. They walked in the plaza, sat in the courtyard of Clara's house, went once to look at the school where Irene had already spoken to the principal about a teaching position and had been received with encouraging warmth. They talked the way they had talked on the road, easily and at length, and with the growing ease of people who have discovered that the other person's mind is a place they like to spend time. On the 8th day in Santa Fe, Clara Davis came to George's boarding house. He was on the porch cleaning Ruby's bridle when Clara arrived, and she sat down on the other porch chair with the direct, forthright manner of a woman who has something to say and intends to say it. "My sister is in love with you," Clara said without preamble. She has not said so because she is still in the middle of figuring out what she is allowed to want, and because she is careful with her words after years of having them used against her. "But I know my sister." George set down the bridle. "Mrs. Davis," he said carefully. "Clara," she said, "and do not tell me it is complicated. I know it is complicated. I also know that complicated things can be worth the patience they require." She looked at him steadily. "The question I am asking is a simple one. Do you intend to be here, or are you planning to ride on once you are satisfied she is safe?" George looked at the bridle in his hands and then at Clara Davis. "I am looking at a piece of land 8 miles northeast of town," he said. "Good spring, standing structure, good soil. I have an appointment at the land office Monday morning." Clara looked at him for a moment, and then a slow smile moved across her face. "Well," she said. "Good," and she stood up and walked away as briskly as she had arrived. The matter of Clifford Beaumont could not be entirely avoided, and it was Thomas Davis who helped George navigate it. Thomas, it turned out, had connections in Abilene through his printing business. He had corresponded with a newspaper editor there for years, and through this network he was able to confirm, over the course of 2 weeks of careful letter writing, what George had already suspected, that Clifford Beaumont had, in fact, filed for desertion in Abilene, not because he wanted Irene back, but because filing allowed him to control the narrative of the marriage and protect himself legally. When Thomas's contact reported this, and then further reported that Beaumont had already, within weeks of Irene's departure, been seen publicly with another woman, a widow from the merchant class, the picture became clearer and, in a way, simpler. Thomas, with his printing connections and his methodical lawyer-like mind, helped Irene begin the process of legal separation under territorial law, which in New Mexico Territory in 1882 was somewhat more accessible to women than it was in many eastern states, a fact that Irene received with a mixture of relief and weary amusement at the randomness of it. The process would take time. These things always took time, but it was moving. Irene began teaching at the school in September. She walked there every morning and came back in the afternoon with chalk dust on her dress and the particular energized tiredness of someone doing work that is genuinely satisfying. George watched this transformation with a feeling he did not try to name, and then eventually did name, because the name was straightforward, and he was not a man who benefited from dishonesty with himself. He had been in love with her since approximately the campfire in the cottonwood draw, if not before, and now that they were both standing on the ground of a real life rather than the compressed drama of a road, the feeling had settled into something permanent and bedrock-like. He bought the land 8 miles northeast of town. He moved out there in October, to the standing structure, which was a good adobe house in reasonable condition, and began the work of making it into something. He had a talent for the practical, for building and repairing and figuring out what a piece of land needed and providing it. He planted things. He got 2 horses in addition to Ruby and began training them, which was work he found deeply satisfying. He fenced a kitchen garden. He cut firewood with the methodical pleasure of a man who has found a place he intends to stay. Irene came out to the property on a Sunday in October with Clara and Thomas, and walked the fenced yard and looked at the adobe house and the spring and the kitchen garden and the horse pen and said, "You have done a great deal in 3 weeks." "I work fast when I know what I am working toward," George said. She looked at him in the October afternoon light, with the mountains dark and clear in the distance and the smell of sage in the cooling air, and said, "What are you working toward, George?" "You know what I am working toward," he said quietly. She was very still. The wind moved her hair slightly. Clara and Thomas had tactfully wandered in the opposite direction, toward the spring, and were examining something with great interest that probably did not require both of them. "I am still married," she said. "I know that. The proceedings will take at least another year, possibly longer. I know that too. You have purchased land here. Yes. You intend to stay. Yes." She looked at him with those direct, honest eyes. "And if I said to you that I was not ready yet, that I needed time to be myself here, to know what I want without anyone else's plans built around it, I would say that was entirely reasonable," George said. "I am not asking you to be ready. I am asking you to know that I am here and that I am not going anywhere." She breathed in slowly. "That is a lot to offer someone." "It is a specific thing to offer a specific person," he said. "It is not a lot in general. It is the right amount for what this is." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, with the deliberate, chosen quality of a woman who has spent years learning to be careful and who now, in this moment, decides to be brave instead, she reached out and took his hand. George looked down at her hand in his and felt the whole of the cottonwood draw and the moonlit trading post porch, and the campfire conversations settle into this point of contact with a finality that was so quiet and so complete it barely announced itself. "I need time," she said. "I know," he said. "But I know what I want," she said. "So do I," he said. They stood like that in the October afternoon for a long while, with the mountains watching and the sage fragrant around them, and Clara and Thomas still examining the spring with great diligence. And it was enough. It was, in that moment, completely and exactly enough. The winter that followed was one of the better winters George could remember. He was not the kind of man who usually had much to say for winters. Too many years of cold line camps and miserable trail work had given him a predictably skeptical view of the season. But this winter in New Mexico territory was different. It was cold, properly cold, with snow that came in December and lay on the mountains in thick white caps, and dusted the sage-covered land around his property in a way that was unexpectedly beautiful. He kept the adobe warm with the firewood he had been cutting since October, and on the days when Irene came out to the property Sundays, most often, sometimes a Saturday afternoon, they sat by the fire and talked and drank coffee and fell further into each other with the unhurried, inevitable quality of two people who have already established where things are going and have decided to enjoy the journey there. She was changing, in this winter. He watched it with deep attention and quiet pleasure. The careful, calculating quality that she had arrived in Santa Fe with, that constant, low-level watchfulness for the shift in the room's atmosphere, for the approaching shadow of another person's mood, was softening. Not disappearing entirely, because that kind of watchfulness leaves marks, and George was under no illusion that marks like hers dissolved in a few months. But softening. She laughed more easily. She offered opinions without the slight pause beforehand, where she used to check whether they were safe to say. She disagreed with him sometimes, directly and without apology, and he found this wonderful. He disagreed with her too, when he had cause to. They had their first real argument in February about something practical. She had an idea about a specific way to redirect the spring water to a different part of the kitchen garden that George thought was technically flawed, and he said so. And she said he was wrong, and they went back and forth about it with some heat. And then she went out and looked at the spring again and came back and said, "You are partly right and partly wrong." And he went out and looked again and came back and said, "That is fair. Let us find a third option." And they spent 2 hours working it out together. When it was done and they were standing back looking at the redirected water, she had a look on her face that he had not seen before, satisfied and flushed and bright-eyed, the look of someone who had just argued for something they believed and been taken seriously. "Good fight," she said. "Excellent fight," he agreed. "We will have better ones." "I hope so," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, the casual, future-tense assumption of it, that told him they had moved, without formal announcement, into a new phase of the thing between them. In March, Irene received word through Thomas's contacts that Clifford Beaumont had married the widow from the merchant class, had married her just 4 months after Irene's departure, in a quiet ceremony, and that he had apparently told people that Irene had passed away from an illness. Irene sat with this news for an evening, and George let her sit with it without trying to push her through it. She was angry, and she was also, underneath the anger, something else, something lighter, something like the releasing of a weight she had been carrying without fully knowing how heavy it was. "He has already moved on," she said, not bitterly, just factually. "He was never grieving my absence. He was only grieving the affront of it." "Yes," George said. "He told people I was dead," she said. "Which means," George said carefully, "that he is not looking for you." She considered this. "No," she said, with the slow recognition of someone seeing the shape of something clearly for the first time. "He is not. He would not. He would lose face if it came out that I was alive and had left him. He is too proud for that." She sat back. "He has written his own end of the story." "And you can write yours," George said. She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight of the kitchen of the adobe house, and for a moment her face was completely unguarded, all the layers off, all the careful architecture dismantled, and what was underneath was clear and bright and real. "I already am," she said. The legal proceeding moved faster than expected, aided by Beaumont's new marriage, which constituted its own legal irregularity since he had not obtained a proper dissolution. Thomas Davis, with his meticulous paperwork and his connections, worked this angle with careful efficiency, and by June of 1883, 14 months after Irene had ridden out of Abilene before dawn, the documents were signed and witnessed and filed, and she was legally no longer Irene Beaumont. She was Irene Atwood again. She was 25 years old, and she was entirely her own. She rode out to the property on the Saturday after the papers were filed, without Clara and Thomas this time, just herself on Cottonwood with her dark hair loose under her hat, and an expression on her face that George saw coming up the road from a quarter-mile away and recognized as something he would spend a long time wanting to see. She dismounted in the yard, and he came out to meet her, and she did not say anything for a moment. She just looked at him. He looked back. "Hello, Irene Atwood," he said. "Hello, George Atkins," she said. And then she closed the distance between them, chose it, deliberately, clearly, without hesitation, and he met her in the middle. And what happened then in the dusty June yard of the adobe house 8 miles northeast of Santa Fe was the end of one story and the beginning of another, and it was very good. They were married in September of 1883 in the courtyard of Clara and Thomas's house, with the fig tree still heavy with fruit and the mountains sharp and blue against a clear morning sky. It was a small ceremony. Thomas stood with George and Clara stood with Irene, and the justice of the peace who performed it was a compact, cheerful man who seemed genuinely pleased by the occasion. Irene wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored with a pale green ribbon at the collar, and she wore her hair pinned up with one of her mother's old combs, and she stood in the dappled light of the fig tree and looked at George with those clear, direct eyes, and said her words with a steadiness and a conviction that made Clara cry, though Clara would later deny that the sound she made was crying and insist it was simply a response to a speck of dust. George said his words plainly, in the way he said all things, and held her hands, and when the justice of the peace concluded the ceremony and the assembled 8 people, Clara and Thomas, the 2 Davis children, Ephraim Walters, who had made the trip from Post Oak Springs and been surprised by the invitation, but touched enough to come, Mrs. Hensley, who had come from Haskell with a freshly baked pie wrapped in cloth, began to clap. George looked at Irene and smiled with his whole face in a way he did not often allow himself, and she smiled back with the same uncomplicated completeness. Ephraim Walters gave a toast that involved a lengthy detour through the history of cottonwood trees and eventually arrived at something heartfelt about water finding its level. Mrs. Hensley's pie was exceptional. The Davis children, who were 7 and 5, fell asleep in their chairs before the afternoon was out and were carried inside by Thomas with the practiced efficiency of a man well acquainted with the logistics of small sleeping people. George and Irene rode home together in the evening, through the last of the amber light, with the mountains turning dark against a sky going pink and gold. Ruby and Cottonwood moved easily beside each other, the way they had been doing for a year and a half now, as if they too had simply settled into an arrangement that suited them. "You are not sorry," Irene said, somewhere along the road. It was not quite a question. "I have never been less sorry about anything in my life," George said. She reached across the space between the horses and put her hand on his arm for a moment, and he put his hand over hers, and they rode the rest of the way home like that, through the sage-scented dusk, into the lamplight of the adobe house where a new life had been building itself, piece by quiet piece, since a man had turned his horse around in the Texas panhandle and ridden in the wrong direction. The years that followed were full. George expanded the horse operation. He had a genuine gift for it, for reading horses and training them, for knowing which animals had the temperament for which purposes, and his reputation for producing reliable, well-mannered horses spread among the ranches and settlements within a 2-day ride of Santa Fe. He did not get rich, But he did well, and he did work he was proud of, which he found to be worth considerably more than he had once known. Irene taught at the school for 3 years, and then in 1886, when their son was born, a boy they named Will, after Irene's father William Atwood, who had died 2 years prior, and whom she had been able to visit that last year, for the first time in too long, she shifted to taking on private pupils at the adobe house, which suited her even better and allowed her to shape the work around the rhythms of the family rather than the other way around. She was a very good teacher, exactly as George had predicted from watching her for 10 days on a panhandle road, and her pupils ranged in age from 6 to 60, and included the elderly wife of a rancher east of town who had always wanted to read properly and had decided at 72 that she had waited long enough. Will was a large, cheerful baby who arrived in the world with strong opinions and a magnificent set of lungs, and who grew into a large, cheerful toddler with strong opinions and a magnificent set of lungs, and who attached himself to Cottonwood at an early age with the determined devotion of someone who has found his animal. Cottonwood, who was now 14 and had developed a profound gentleness with the children he encountered, accepted Will's devotion with dignified patience and very good humor. In 1888, a daughter arrived, who they named Me, and who was small and fierce and dark-eyed like Irene, and looked at the world from the beginning with the same calm, direct gaze that George had found so striking in a boarding-house kitchen in Haskell 6 years before. Me had opinions about everything and announced them clearly and early, to the great delight of her parents and the respectful consternation of her older brother. Clara and Thomas were frequent visitors, the children growing up between the two households with the easy familiarity of cousins, and the fig tree in Clara's courtyard was the scene of many a Sunday dinner that expanded over the years to include neighbors and friends, and the Davis children's friends and Irene's pupils, and various people from the Santa Fe community, who had drifted into their orbit in the way that good-hearted people attract each other. George, who was not built for town life, found nonetheless that he was built for exactly this kind of company, specific, chosen, known. He thought occasionally about the man who had hired him and the road that had led from that man's lie to this life. He did not think about Clifford Beaumont with hatred, because hatred was a weight he preferred not to carry, but he thought about him clearly and without illusion, and the fact that Beaumont's deception had ultimately sent George directly toward the best thing in his life struck him sometimes as one of the more ironic constructions of fate. He supposed that Irene would say fate was too grand a word for it, that it was simply the result of a series of choices, her choice to leave, his choice to listen, his choice to turn around, and he supposed she was right. She usually was. In the summer of 1890, 8 years after George had ridden into Haskell on a chestnut mare with a folded letter in his pocket, he came in from a late evening with the horses to find Irene sitting on the porch of the adobe house in the last of the daylight, with Me asleep in her lap, and Will visible through the window at the kitchen table, head bent over a book. The mountains were the deep blue-purple they went at dusk, and the sage was fragrant from an afternoon rain, and the sky above the mountains was going from orange to gold to a pale, translucent green at the top of the arch. He sat down beside her and she leaned her shoulder against his, and they looked at the sky together. Me did not stir. "Tell me something," Irene said in that quiet evening voice she had. "What would you like to know? Tell me what you were thinking," she said, "that first day, when you rode into Haskell and sat on Mrs. Hensley's porch before you came inside." He thought about it seriously, the way she always asked him to think about things. "I was thinking that something about the job was wrong," he said. "Not dangerous wrong, just wrong in a moral sense. And I was trying to figure out how wrong before I went in. And then I went in," he said, "and I found out." She was quiet a moment. "Were you afraid of what you would find?" "Not afraid," he said. "I think I was afraid of what I would have to do if I found what I thought I would find." "And what you thought you would find was the truth," she said. "Yes. And the truth meant giving up the rest of the money and putting yourself on the wrong side of a paying client. Yes, and you did it anyway. You know I did. She shifted slightly, careful not to wake me. I think about that sometimes, she said. What would have happened if you had been a different kind of man? If you had come into that kitchen and simply told me it was time to go back. She paused. I would not have gone. I want you to know that. I would have found a way regardless, but it would have been much harder. You would have managed, George said. You would have managed regardless. Perhaps, she said, but I am very glad I did not have to find out. He looked at her in the evening light, the fine-boned face, the dark eyes, the strand of hair that had come loose from its pin exactly the way it always did, as though her hair had been doing this specific thing all her life and intended to keep doing it, and felt the full weight of gratitude for the specific shape of his own life, which was not something he would have predicted feeling as a younger man, who had thought gratitude was for the religious and the sentimental, and had not yet understood that it was simply accurate accounting. So am I, he said. She smiled, and he put his arm around her, careful of the sleeping me, and she settled against him. And they watched the last of the light go out of the western sky together while inside the house Will turned a page in his book and outside Cottonwood moved quietly in the horse Pen and Ruby, 20 years old now and gray around the muzzle and absolutely uninterested in retiring, stood at the fence and watched the mountains go dark. The following spring, a third child arrived, another boy, who they named Henry after no one in particular, simply because the name suited him, and who was born on a morning in April when the apricot trees George had planted along the south fence of the yard were in full bloom, white and fragrant, and improbable in the high desert air. He was a calm baby, which surprised both of them after Will's enthusiastic arrival and me's fierce one, and he looked at everything around him from the beginning with an expression of mild, interested approval, as though the world were proceeding more or less as he had expected. Clara held him in the courtyard of the adobe house on the day of his birth, and looked at him with the particular, steady love of an aunt who had been part of this family's story from the beginning, who had worried for years and then rejoiced, and who now looked at this small, calm person with the clear understanding that she was looking at the future. He has your patience, she told George, and Irene's eyes. A good combination, Thomas said, from where he was sitting against the courtyard wall with Will and me, both of whom had received the new brother with the pragmatic enthusiasm of children old enough to understand that a baby means things will change but young enough to expect mostly good changes. A very good combination, George agreed. The adobe house grew that summer. George added 2 rooms on the western end, a proper bedroom for the boys and a study for Irene's teaching work, with a window that looked toward the mountains, and a shelf George built himself that Irene filled with every book she could find or obtain or beg from the Santa Fe lending library. The house that had been a standing structure on a piece of bare land 8 years ago was now a home in every sense of the word, with the kitchen garden producing abundantly, and the fig tree Clara had given them from a cutting thriving against the south wall, and the horse pen full, and the yard full of the particular organized, happy chaos of a family that has found its shape and settled into it. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, George and Irene sat on the porch together in the way they had always sat, in the companionable, easy quiet of 2 people who have talked so much over so many years. That silence between them is not absence but presence, is not empty but full. Sometimes they talked about practical things, the horses, the school, a letter from one of Irene's old pupils, the state of the road to town after the spring rains. Sometimes they talked about larger things, the territory moving toward statehood, the continuing injustice of the reservation system, and what it was costing the people George carried in his blood, the way the town was changing as more people came west. Sometimes they said nothing at all, and just watched the stars come out over the mountains, which in New Mexico territory was a sight worth watching in respectful quiet. George had written, eventually, to the family on the Comanche reservation in Indian Territory. The connection to his mother's people, which he had carried quietly all his life. The letters were tentative and uncertain at first, reaching toward a relationship that had been severed long before he was old enough to understand what had been lost. But letters were exchanged, and then more letters, and one summer a man who was his mother's nephew made the journey to Santa Fe and sat in the courtyard of the adobe house and shared a meal with George and Irene and the children, and talked for 2 days about things that George had not known and had needed to know. It did not fix what had been broken by history and by the policies of a government that had moved entire peoples onto patches of land and called it settlement. It did not pretend to. But it was something real, and it mattered, and George was grateful for it. He was grateful for a great many things in those years. He had grown into gratitude the way you grow into a coat that is made well and fits exactly, not all at once, but by degrees, until one day you look down and realize it fits you perfectly, and you cannot imagine having been without it. Irene grew into happiness the same way. Not the dramatic, arriving kind that you find in stories, but the real kind built from accumulated days of teaching, a stubborn child to read and watching the moment of comprehension break over their face, from the smell of coffee on a cold morning, from the sound of her children's voices mixing together in the next room, from an argument about the kitchen garden well conducted, from the particular look in a pair of steady dark eyes that had first found her in the kitchen of a panhandle boarding house and had not once looked away from her since. There were hard things too, because there always are. A drought year that required careful management and the difficult decision to sell 2 horses they could not afford to feed. A winter when Henry was 4 that brought a fever through the house and scared them both in ways that neither fully articulated, though they slept in shifts by his bed until the fever broke. The death of Cottonwood when he was 22, which hit Will at 16 with the full, tender force of a young person losing their first great animal companion, and which Irene handled with a practicality and a gentleness that George watched and filed away in the growing archive of reasons. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Ruby outlasted Cottonwood by 2 years, which surprised everyone and surprised no one, because Ruby had always had an exceptional and slightly unreasonable determination to persist. She died on a mild March morning in 1904, quietly, in the paddock in the sun, and George buried her under the cottonwood sapling he had planted years ago on the east side of the property, which was now a substantial tree. He stood there a while afterward, hand on the trunk of the tree, thinking about a road through the Texas Panhandle and the red cliffs above a clear stream in New Mexico Territory, and a gray gelding with a sensible temperament who had made an excellent friend. Irene came and stood beside him without being asked. She was a good horse, Irene said. The best I ever had, George said. Until Cottonwood, he paused. They would have approved of each other. They did approve of each other, Irene said, from the first day. He looked at her, and she was smiling in the March sunlight with the small, private smile that was just for him, that had been just for him since a campfire in a cottonwood draw. And he was 50 years old, and had a tree named after a horse named after a tree and 3 children who were fine people and a wife, who was his great good fortune, and his equal in all the ways that mattered. And the sky above New Mexico Territory was immense and blue and going on forever. It had all begun because a man sat on a boarding house porch in Haskell, Texas, in the spring of 1882, and took his hat off and set it on his knee and thought, seriously and without shortcuts, about what he was about to do. And then he had done the right thing, and then he had turned his horse around, and everything after that had been, in the truest sense, everything.